Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Nicole A. Watson, and I'm the Associate Artistic Director of the McCarter Theater Center. And I want to welcome you tonight to tonight's final panel in our Adrienne Kennedy Festival. I wanted to say a few things. I am zooming in from the land of the Pawtucket, otherwise known as Lowell, Massachusetts, and I want to acknowledge the ancestral lands of the Pawtucket and their care for this land, as I am here today, zooming in with all of you. Again, thank you for joining us tonight for this conversation. I will keep it brief. Again, this is the last panel of our Festival of the Works of Adrienne Kennedy. There are 3 plays that are up and running that you'll be able to see. And our last play, Etta and Ella on the Upper West Side, which will be a world premiere, will premiere in January of 2021. So something to look forward to, hopefully many things to look forward to in the upcoming new year. I'm going to start introducing our moderator and our panelists for tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Raymond O. Caldwell. So, hi, Raymond.
Nicole, what's going on?
Not too much. I'm going to read a little bit about you, if you don't mind.
Cool.
So welcome, Raymond. So to everyone tuning in, Raymond O. Caldwell was appointed Producing Artistic Director of Theater Alliance in January 2019, which recently won 7 Helen Hayes Awards this year for Blood at the Root, including Best Play and Best Director. He has directed work and developed arts programming throughout the US, Europe, and Southeast Asia. Before leading Theater Alliance, he was a resident director and professor in the Department of Theater Arts at Howard University. Raymond holds an MFA in acting with a focus in community outreach and developing new work from The Ohio State University, and a BFA in acting from the University of Florida. Welcome, Raymond. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Daniel Alexander Jones. Welcome, Daniel.
Hey, so happy to be here.
Thank you for being here. I'm going to read a little bit about you as well, if you don't mind. So hello, everybody. Daniel Alexander Jones's body of original work includes plays, performance pieces, recorded music, concerts, music theater events, essays, and long-form improvisations. His plays and performance pieces include Blacklight, Duat, An Interrogator's Manual, and Radiate. He is recognized as a key voice in the development of theatrical jazz and has made a significant contribution to Black experimental theater and performance. Daniel's numerous awards include a TED Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a McKnight National Residency and Commission, a Jerome Fellowship, and a Many Voices Playwriting Fellowship. Daniel Alexander did his undergraduate study at Vassar College in Africana Studies with a focus on literature and the arts, and a graduate theater study at Brown University. Thank you for being here, Daniel.
So happy.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, I would like you all to welcome Holly Bass as our next panelist. Hello, Holly. Thank you for being here. Thank you. I'm going to read a little bit about you. So, everybody, Holly Bass is a multidisciplinary performance and visual artist, writer, and director. Her work has been presented at spaces such as the Kennedy Center, the Smithsonian Museums, the Seattle Art Museum, amongst many others. Her visual artwork spans photography, installation, video, and performance, and can be found in the collections of the Corcoran Gallery of Art and the DC Art Bank, as well as private collections. She is a Cave Canem Fellow, and as an arts journalist early in her career, she was the first to put the term hip-hop theater into print in American Theater magazine. She has received numerous grants from the DC Arts Commission and is a 2019 Red Bull Detroit Artist in Residence and a 2019 Dance USA Artist Fellow. She is currently the National Director for Turnaround Arts at the Kennedy Center. Holly earned her BA at Sarah Lawrence College and her master's in journalism at Columbia University. Thank you for being here, Holly. Now, everybody, you are in for a treat. I'm going to let this conversation continue with these 3 amazing humans. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thanks, Nicole. Thank you so much.
Wow.
Thank you. Yo, I am so excited to be here with y'all. Yo, so tonight we're gonna keep it really chill. We're gonna keep it really casual. I was excited to direct Sleep Deprivation Chamber for Roundhouse and thrilled that Roundhouse is actually celebrating the brilliant work and the brilliant mind of Adrienne Kennedy. Adrienne Kennedy's work has been like transformational to my career, my aesthetic. When I was in graduate school, Mrs. Kennedy, as I called her, used to call the Ohio State randomly when I was working in the office. And we had this collection of like really dope conversations that really inspired me. And when I think about my aesthetic, I actually think that my aesthetic totally fits in the space of the avant-garde. So I'm so excited we get to have a conversation about what it is. And I'm excited to have this conversation with two really brilliant artists who I think are defining that space. So I guess to get our conversation just kicked off, at Theater Alliance, we love having conversations. It's what we do. And I think the thing we always start with is like a shared vocabulary, right? So let's just I would love to talk about how you each view the avant-garde. What is the avant-garde? And before we start talking about the Black Avant Garde, just what is avant-garde in your mind or your idea?
Mm-hmm.
And jump on it. I'm not.
Sure. I mean, I don't know if I could answer that without getting into the Black avant-garde and the white avant-garde, right? Because I feel like when I was in college and learning about the avant-garde, it was this very white male kind of like, John Cage and Robert Rauschenberg and Merce Cunningham and Jean Genet, and it was people in Europe and white men in America, and it was difficult to understand, and it was strange and unusual, but also at the same time I was like, I love all of this stuff. Like, I don't know if I totally understand it, or it's certainly not what I grew up with, but I love it. And then I think like when I start really thinking about like in the very simplest terms, avant-garde is to be at the forefront, is to be sort of the initiator, the early adopter. And if I think about that in terms of Black context, I think everything we do almost is avant-garde. Like, we're always at the front. We're always setting the trend. We're always setting the culture, but not necessarily always getting the value or the acclaim. And we certainly see that with the career of, Adrienne Kennedy, where I've read about Miss Kennedy's works. I've read Miss Kennedy's works, but how many have I seen produced? And it's, it's kind of heartbreaking when you think about that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, Daniel, I'll throw it over to you.
Just everything, yes, that you said. But yeah, the idea of the new, quote unquote, the new or the unusual is what we think of with the avant-garde. And, I've always been suspicious of, even since little, of party lines of anything, So when I first came into contact with the avant-garde, I think it was as a young person, I became really interested in, what they call astral jazz or free jazz, like the idea of music that departed from traditional form. And I just got excited because I was like, I get that, like that, I understand. There's something about like, we know this thing over here, but what's over there? And as I came, Holly, like you, to learn about these artists, most of them white men, maybe with the exception of like Gertrude Stein, who were like put forward as these, architects of the avant-garde, I was like, And you do a little digging and you find out that everything they were inspired by was African art, and everything they were inspired by was jazz music. And so ideas about simultaneous time, ideas about multiple realities, concurrent realities, the idea of the interior of the psyche determining one reality and then our behavior in the world determining another, and like construction of like collaging and all that stuff. I'm like, every part of that is ancient tradition that belongs to us. So I kind of am like, whenever I think about it, I also can't think of the avant-garde without saying it's actually, Black.
Oh, I love that. You know, I first was introduced to the avant-garde in Germany. Yeah. And so it was really interesting being in a place and a space where particularly expressionism is so like loved and held on to. And I remember thinking, this is really strange and I like it. But then to your point, Holly, you know, I started realizing, particularly even when I came to the US, that there weren't lots of spaces for weird Black kids, right? And then I started realizing, to your point, because I also loved hip hop was so avant-garde, was the definition of avant-garde. And so it was so interesting to learn about my Blackness in relationship to hip hop and this idea of what the avant-garde is. So to that point, I would love to talk about like Black influence in the avant-garde. I'm loving the opportunity that Roundhouse is actually celebrating Adrienne Kennedy's work, and that today we actually get to pull out and almost look at the container within which her work sits, right? Because I think that, to your point, Holly, Black people are avant-garde. But when you are of the Black avant-garde, you are put into and relegated to a box that's even further down. And so, in that, can we have a conversation about, yeah, what is that space of the Black avant-garde?
Mhm. I have a story actually. When I went to my first attendance at the National Black Theater Festival in North Carolina was 1993, and I went and I was so excited because some of my mentors were there, and some artists that I'd longed to meet, like Ntozake Shange and Laurie Carlos and Robbie McCauley and you know, just like Keith Antar Mason and Sekou Sundiata, like all of these legends who were all avant-garde artists. And the programming was held, all of it was held in like downtown Winston-Salem, except all of the avant-garde pieces were out in the boonies. Like you had to get in a van and drive out into the country to this facility to go see it. And I said they couldn't be better. And I remember that's when I met the great late Rosalind Cash, as I got to sit in a van next to her, and she was like, "Why are we going out here?" You know, to the movie. So it's to me that story is always a testament to me that we've always been here, but we're often relegated to the margin, and our traces are erased from the conversation and the narrative, right? So I go back and I'm like, I think about in the Harlem Renaissance, Marita Bonner and her play The Purple Flower. Yes. And I think about Richard Bruce Nugent and Smoke Lilies and Jade. And I'm like, we've always done it this way. And you know, how it flexes is one thing or another thing, but like, you know, Nugent's elliptical writing is the same as collage and pastiche, which is the foundation of hip hop, right? So it's like, I just always say like, wait a minute, we're here. And we've been here. And so, you know, this is not a new development.
Holly?
I mean, I think of it as, at least in my making and then also in my consuming, at least with the Black avant-garde, like absolutely what you said, it's like being like the fringe of the fringe, but it's also about, you know, I think Daniel hinted at this, or one of us already hinted at this idea of like being rooted in something that's sort of commonly understood. So for instance, I remember hearing the filmmaker Arthur Jaffa talk about, you know, some of the films that he's been making recently, which are hours and hours long, like 12 hours, you know, 20 hours. You couldn't watch the whole thing in one sitting. And he talked about growing up in the Black church and experiencing these really, really long church services, and that his son didn't grow up in the Black church. And they went to a funeral, and he was like, the boy couldn't sit still for 30 minutes. And I'm like, what is wrong with you? Like, this is what we do. We sit, you know, we're going to be here. And I hadn't made that connection until then, but I think my work as a durational performance artist is definitely rooted in these like rural Southern Black church experiences where like we would go to Sunday school, then we would have church, and that church would go from like 11 to about 3. Then you break for lunch, you have supper, and you go back to church. And so, you know, I grew up in California, but my parents are Southern. So the summers I spent were literally like, you go to evening service from like 5:30 till like, I don't know, 8:30 or 9, and then we'd be dark. So you spent all of Sunday in church listening to, you know, like, I don't know of anything to me more avant-garde than Dr. Watts hymns, where you take a line, like I thought I knew what Amazing Grace sounded like, and then it just gets stretched out. And so that stretching of time, that stretching of sound, all of that layering, that's the avant-garde, but it's just part of everyday life. It's a ritual, it's your spiritual practice. You go to church, you eat together, you come back. That's, for me, where it comes from. There's always something that's, you know, rooted. And even, I feel like the most abstract thing I make, I still think like, is there something that my mother could hook onto that she would be like, oh, okay, you know?
Huh, I love that. There's this idea that what holds Black art together are these 5 concepts, right? That all Black art in some way is a byproduct of a sense of protest, a sense of revolt, a sense of assertion, a sense of spirituality, and a sense of music. And so, you know, when I think about Black art and the Black avant-garde, I am really moved by this idea of spirituality. I see the ways in which spirituality works in Adrienne Kennedy's work. So what role does spirituality play in your work and the work of avant-garde artists that you admire or respect?
I would say it's been my spiritual practice, is my art practice, and that my understanding from my mentors, who were, you know, most of them came out of the lineage of For Color Girls, and primary would probably be Laurie Carlos and Robbie McCauley, along with the late great Aisha Rahman, the playwright. And one of the biggest things that they helped me understand is that the way that you like experience time, the living and the dead together commingled, the idea of multiple times simultaneous could be put into performance, could be put on a stage and make sense in the same way that you can have polyvocality and multiple time signatures in music, you know? So for me, I think my spiritual practice has been one of like trying to make visible the invisible and trying to reconnect the consciousness that in the West, we think of the living, we think of the dead, we think of now, the past, the future. And actually it's so much more dynamic and processional than that in my experience and in the experience of most of the people I work with. So that spirit has been really, really key. And one other thing, if I may, Raymond, just say that, you know, I also, part of my upbringing, right, it's, you know, is coming out of this very particular Black feminist school, right? Like, so it's interesting to be, you know, a quote unquote cis male who actually was raised up by Black feminist artists, right? But inside of that is a place where I say the foundation for me is not protest. The foundation for me is being. And there is a place at which my being may come into contact with systems I need to protest or I need to engage, but it is not a reactive place. And I think that's one of the things that makes, for example, Adrienne Kennedy's work confusing to some, is because she's focused on the interior. She's focused on the right to be a sovereign being, you know, so that sovereignty is also connected to spirit to me. So those are the things I would offer in response.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I love that sovereignty. And I think also so much of a Black avant-garde to me is about ritual. And so the way that the work shows up is coming out of, I think of it in some ways is like reconnecting and giving access to sort of lost spaces of connection and ritual, whether that's because of the transatlantic slave trade or because of, a global pandemic that forces us to now be in communication on, cellular devices and streaming platforms like this, that we're always, at least for me, I should maybe speak from the I feel like I'm always seeking communion. It's communion, it's connection, it's community, and doing that through ritual and magic. The magicalness of being Black, and why keep it to yourself? It's like,
come on, ain't that the truth? You both touch on an idea that I would love to then tease out now. As we were rehearsing and filming Sleep Deprivation Chamber, and even at Howard University, when I taught it to students, students and Black students coming from all around the United States, all around the world, in classrooms, the first time that they had ever been exposed to this type of work, the voice of Adrienne Kennedy. And they asked immediately, why isn't this produced right now? Because there's this idea that Kennedy's work isn't understood, but I think it wasn't possibly understood within its time by some. Yeah, a lot of people understood it. Let's get that clear. But generationally, I find young people now pick up something like Sleep Deprivation Chamber or the Ohio State murders, and they actually are seeing the cinematic work, the type of storytelling that actually they're now so accustomed to. So Adrienne Kennedy was the vanguard. She was way ahead of her time. And so to that end, has the Black avant-garde changed? Is there a new Black avant-garde? And what are the ways that, if that is the case, the Black avant-garde of the past is different than the Black avant-garde of the now and or future? Also, I'm gonna tell everybody who's watching a very real thing. I had some really cute little questions that I sent Daniel and Holly, and then the conversation got good and they started saying some real good things. So all types of questions started popping into my head.
I'm inclined to think that the Black avant-garde hasn't changed. I think that's also my personal bias as a sort of student of history. Like, the more I read about history, the more I think, oh my God, we've been doing the same thing since we got to this country. Like, the conditions of this country have forced us to be doing the same thing. I don't know about before we were in this country, but I don't think the Black avant-garde has changed. The other thing is that it's like we're so avant-garde, people don't even see us as avant-garde.
Tell it.
Say that.
I don't mean to get too
that's right,
romantic, but it's literally true.
That's
like
true.
Everything we do, like if I just think about hip hop, right? We talked about hip hop earlier, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember writing an essay and saying that hip hop was organic postmodernism. And, I was in college and learning about postmodernism and deconstructing things and, like interrogating things. But I was like, literally teenage kids in the Bronx were doing this. Like, you don't need like Derrida and Foucault, and like, it's right there. It's right there. We've been doing it with language. We've been doing it with music. We've been doing it with movement. We've been doing it with visuals. Like, we literally just do it all the time. I think right now, I watch a lot of TikTok. I'm like the only person in my friend group who's like, I'm like hitting mid-century, and all my friends are like, why? But there's so much good avant-garde work.
Yeah, content.
That content, like these 60 seconds, and I'm just like, I'm loving it. I'm loving it. It's amazing.
I always think about who it serves to say something's confusing.
Yeah.
Like, who does it serve? Like, what is the story that's getting fed there, right? And historically, again, like, if I tell you you don't make sense, then you're immediately put to the side, right? And that historically has always been the case with Black folks in general. unless it's like within the rubric of a certain kind of innocuous entertainment, right?
Mm.
If I tell you you don't make sense, that's generally Black women, right? Like, like cite your sources, queer folks, all of this. And what I think has happened is that there's this because these younger generations are so beautifully distrustful of inherited narratives and so much more interested in that immediate reflection, and they have the technology to be able to look and be like, oh, that is me. That's the thing I like. So, for us back, and I turned 50 this year. And so when I was in school, you had to go read the play or go see the play or be in the blah, blah, whatever. But I remember it was never a thing of like, oh, I don't understand what that is. It's like, oh, Betty Carter, when I hear her sing, makes sense to me. Alice Coltrane makes sense to me. And Adrienne Kennedy's play structure made sense to me. So then when I was told by people, you don't make sense, Daniel, I was like, well, what's that about? Like, what is going on here? And it's a power dynamic, because if I make sense, if they make sense, then if you're the person who's the programmer, the gatekeeper, the determinant critical voice, either you have to surrender your idea that your view and your structure is the authority, or you have to be you or not, and I think that's really what we get into here, is that I think it's a reflection of the fact that, it's this deep critique of a kind of linear patriarchal ontology that is finally like, people are just like, we're done. We're done. We're done. And the only longing I have is Holly, like you, how can we, and not in like, I don't want to be the old man on the porch, but not in the way of like, if you only knew what we did before, but to say to young people, which in school I try to do, is like, I just want to connect you to your lineage. So you can know that there have been the people that came before, not to shame you out of making your own thing or to tell you theirs is better, but that you're in a continuum. That's the part that I think where the work is.
I love that. That's really, really quite beautiful. And I think connected to the next question I have, I think that there might be a lot of young people who see themselves as avant-garde artists, right? And they want to create within this space. What do they do? What do you say to them? And what are some like sources of inspiration that you find? Because I find that in this moment, in this COVID world, the one thing that we as artists can do is create, but finding those sources of inspiration for creativity in this space, in this moment, can be really difficult. And so to those young artists who are out there listening, what are some sources of inspiration that you can provide, and how do you work in this moment?
Well, I'll say one thing. There's that expression, necessity is the mother of invention. But I also think obstruction, like barriers, problems, constraints, can actually be wildly useful for creativity. And so in some ways, when I think about the sort of trajectory of my work, having limited resources of space, having limited resources of money forced me to be more inventive. And I think that's true of every generation of young artists. And I just love when I see like, Raymond and I both live in Washington, D.C. And when I moved there 25 years ago, it was pretty affordable, actually. And now it's gotten so expensive. But I don't know. I'm like, these kids found a warehouse. They talked a real estate developer into letting them use this empty space for 6 months as long as they clean it up and don't, burn it down. And so I think like it's all about working your way around whatever conventions or constraints are in your way and allowing that to push you further. And even the pandemic, I made my first live stream performance. I did not want to do a live stream performance. I was very like, my work is about tactile interaction. People have to, like, I want to be in your face. I want to be able to reach out and touch you. And then it was like, well, are you not going to make work for 3 years? Like what? So, adapting and then finding pleasure and newness in adapting to these constraints. It's been a really kind of nice silver lining in the midst of all of this.
Mm-hmm. And there's, I think we're so fortunate in that there's this constellation of artists that find each other, and I think part of it is just saying you're interested in something, and like it's old school, like honestly, like I went up to people that I admired, and I mean now it's a little more complicated, but it's sort of like be proximate to the work as best you can, get it in you, like find stuff out. And also going off the beaten path. I think part of the dilemma is that, and this is a really a tricky question. I'm thinking about Adrienne Kennedy, especially, like, if it weren't for the fact that there was for a period a small group of people, largely in the academy, who just were dogged in their insistence that they keep her name and her work front and center, it wouldn't have survived on some level. I think that can be said, because the American theater was not doing right by her. I think things have changed now, but it wasn't doing right by her. And so she's an example to me that if in the early 1980s, for example, you said, well, who are the great Black playwrights? It could be that her name would be left off that list. Yeah. So for her, there are another 10 writers who didn't get their name called, like a Kathleen Collins, for example. I'm thinking of like so many different writers that like are just in these circles outside of the mainstream. So who chooses our famous folk, who chooses our heroes is another part of the question. And so I just say to younger folk, like in terms of, do your thing, experiment wildly. I love everything Holly said, like just amen to all of it, like just 100%. And go searching, be an archivist, an archaeologist, go find out who you don't know about. And dare I say, when you can, go in an actual library and like really, and just start digging. Just start picking stuff up at random.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that. While we're in this space of talking to young artists, the thing that happens for avant-garde artists, and I think, Daniel, you started to touch on this, there is a phase of your work where it feels like no one likes what you're creating, right? And it can feel really lonely, right? Because you ideally are the vanguard. And so as you are the vanguard, you have to become very comfortable in a space of not being liked. But how do you grapple with that when we are programmed in this time to chase likes, to be liked? Particularly when I am talking and thinking about a younger generation. Thoughts, ideas, inspiration.
I love that you said that. I was actually thinking about that before you said it, this idea of like, if you choose this path, you also have to understand sort of that, yes, there's a lineage and people who have laid down some, flagstones for you, but it's not a smooth path at all. And I think about, I think it was, let's see, my mind's going blank. It'll come back to me. But Carrie Mae Weems was at a panel discussion, and a friend asked, like, what did you do? Like, now you're Carrie Mae Weems and we're in a museum and we're celebrating you. But for a long time, you were making this work and not really getting, so much recognition. And like, what did you do? How did you sustain yourself? And she said, well, I always knew that these structures weren't made for me. They weren't designed for me. So I just kept making my work. And I think the other question for me that's tied in with that, like being willing to not be the most popular or not be liked, but also how do you make sure that your work contains rigor and that it contains craft, even as it may not be the most popular, sparkling thing, because that can be hard too. Like, so maybe it's about seeking respect rather than likes. and understanding there were a lot of people whose respect I had to earn.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember certain, like, I'm not going to call them out or name them, but there's certain people, they come to my shows and they wouldn't say anything. And them not saying anything was because they liked me, but they didn't like the work. It was very clear to me because I knew how they treated other artists. And I was like, I just want one compliment from that person. I just want one compliment. And my God, it took years. But when I finally got, like, I remember one of them saying, your work is coming along. I was like, okay, thank God. At least I know I'm moving in the right direction. So I'm like, part of me was like, maybe I just suck. Like, maybe it's really terrible. I mean, I like it, but what if it's actually not good at all, like by anyone's standards? So I think there's that importance of cultivating a community around you in the same way that we do it, you know, for our growth edges and our social justice work. We need people who will hold us accountable and who will challenge us. We need that creatively too. So it's not about likes. It's not about, you know, yes manning, yes womaning, personing the people around you, but affirming and requesting accountability at the same time. But you have to find your people to make that happen.
Yeah. 100% finding your people is key. And, you know, this was my 25th anniversary of being a professional, you know, like I started before that, but like being out in the world and it's been, you know, it's been a really intense year to reflect and think about what it took to keep going, you know, and what, you know, I have dear friends who we talk a lot about how many of our mentors are dead, and they're dead because they didn't take care of themselves along the way. And many of them did so because they put others first. And they were, you know, I was a beneficiary, as were many others, of their decision to say, we're going to make a space for you, little odd duck. You know, like, we're going to be like, you know, you don't fit. Good. And here, you know, and so I think some of the greatest lessons were about, like, you know, did you eat today? Do you know how to deal when you don't have any money? If you're dealing with trouble and suffering, have you helped somebody else? Like, what are you doing in the world, you know, on a multi-tiered level? So it's like learning those life lessons to just be a person, a citizen in a deep and rigorous way. But also, you know, I think about, there's a kind of a legendary story that when John Coltrane died, Alice Coltrane went into this, several months, it may have even been a year period where she kind of went on this series of rites of passage where she was going through spiritual tests. And it was like this fire. She fasted, she had like pain and visions, and like she withdrew from the world. And there's some way in which that kind of ascetic experience, and I'm not saying that if you choose this path you have to be a monk and be off, or, you know, like out in the field, but I think there is some reckoning you have to do that is metaphysical, that is about why you are doing the work. And we all know, and it's beloved in our culture, the people that go to church to be seen at church. And then there's the people who pray. And it's about, I think if you're going to do this work for the long haul, you have to pray. You have to be doing it for a reason that is beyond any other human being's comprehension, but that is really about you and the divine. I really believe that. And so if you choose that, it's going to have trials. It's going to have grace periods. But if you do it with humility and you find your people and you commit to your people, not out of utility and transaction, but out of a desire to genuinely build that community that you're talking about, Holly, where it's like that mutual respect and the willingness to be in the cut with each other, to be like, okay, what are you working on? Let me look at it. And you know, like, what do you think, this color or that color, or that, you know, where does that line go? That line get cut, you know, like all that stuff. Then you do something else. And I think that is the thing that I look back at our elders, and I'm like, I think the ones who made it the longest and the healthiest were those that had a community.
Mm. I love that. I hope these people are listening. All of these pearls that y'all are laying everywhere for the children. I'm going to have one more question, and then I do want to go ahead and open it up because I'm sure folks do have questions. So if you do have a question, just be sure to go ahead and drop it in the chat function, and we will then start answering some questions. But before we do that, I just want to one more question for you, because it's something that both of you began to touch upon, this idea of process. You know, as we start thinking about the avant-garde, sometimes it asks for different processes. And that can be really scary, particularly if it's a process that you don't know about, that you've never been a part of. I think about, I was out on tour with Ntozake Shange when she was doing her last show, and I didn't understand a line. And I remember going to her office and knocking on her door terrified, right? And like, Miss Shange, and I was really there because I wanted to be in the presence of Ntozake Shange. Let me not lie. But also, it was so fascinating because when I asked her the question about a line, I had never been into her office. And when I walked into her office, she had these little Post-its everywhere. And this was the process that she was working on the show. And when I asked her what the line meant, she literally went and found a Post-it, read it, and then handed it to me and said, "There's the answer." And it was the most revelatory experience I think I've ever had with another artist. And I still don't think I understand what that Post-it meant or said, but revelatory, because it in some way informed my process. So can you talk about process, your process, how you work? Is there one way that you create, or is it different for every piece project?
I feel like the longer I live, the more I think the process is probably the same, but it's like a mystery it's a mystery to me that I'm learning and discovering still. So I don't think I will ever get to the center of the onion, but the more I do it, the more I'm like, oh, I think I remember this from, last time or 5 years ago. Like, this is the moment where I panic and nothing seems to make sense. But it's okay, because it happens pretty much every time. So it must be part of the process. So this time we're gonna panic less. And we're just gonna take our time, even though, we see that clock ticking down in the background, but it doesn't matter because this is the thing that has to happen right now. So it's sort of like one of those movies where someone wakes up every day and has to restart their day. I feel like that a little bit. And each time I get a little bit further in my day toward the solution that will then allow me to move my life forward. And I actually, it's kind of joyful, even though there's a sort of emotional arc that happens. And then there's, certain phases, like the research phase. And then you're living your life, but you're actually still researching, while you're riding the bus and walking down the street and humming, that all of it is coming in. And then the nitty gritty when there is an actual production and you're like, okay, there's a moment when things are going to be on stage in front of an audience, right? So we're going to speed this along. But I'm sort of excited to be oh, I understand my process a little bit. Okay, all right. And also it's amazing to me. There's also this other thing that often happens where not me procrastinating, not just something extraordinary happens that's bad. And it's how are you going to solve this one? And it always gets solved. I had a show once where, and I'll just tell this one quick story and then wrap up. We were working with an organization that was dealing with human trafficking, and they had paired each of us with someone who had firsthand experience in some form of human trafficking, whether it was sex trafficking or domestic labor trafficking. So I was working with this wonderful woman, based in Washington, D.C., named Tina Frunt, who is a survivor who is running an organization. And maybe 2 days before the show, she's not answering her cell phone at all. So we had decided, rather than me just relaying her words, that we would make a duet. Like, she would be on stage. I was, like, right? That's so avant-garde. You're like, I don't need to be your voice piece. You speak your words, and I'll do my dancey thing over here, or whatever I was doing. Not answering her cell phone. I'm like, whoa, what's going on? Come to find out, she's in Annapolis, Maryland, at a courthouse trying to help a young woman through a court case. And they take your phone when you're in court. And then she left the phone there, but all of it was to say she was not going to be on stage because she was actually doing the real work. And so I had 24 hours. And I did the dress rehearsal by myself, playing both roles. And people were like, you could do that for the show. We enjoyed it. I was like, okay, that's crazy. But I used every form of social media, phone tree, got an actress at 10 p.m. that night, Miriam Foy. She came, she learned the script overnight. We went shopping for clothes at a thrift store like that afternoon. We showed up at the theater at 5, did a run through. We did the show at 8, and no one in the audience knew. And that's just miraculous to me. And I think that there's something about like this idea of process being able to go deeper into an intuitive space where no matter what goes wrong, if you know you're supposed to be doing this work, then the work is supposed to happen.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, to all that. I want to claim publicly that I want to work with you. Like, you're amazing. I'm just so down. Like, I'm so excited. But yeah, there's a few things. There's number one is like, I always try to do something I never did before when I take on a new project. I'm like, what haven't I, like, what don't I do, and like, but really don't do. So like, so I have to have a learning curve, whether it's like learning how to use an instrument or doing, God forbid, some dance move or something like that. Like, dude, like, what is a thing that I can do? Number two, that, the gift of getting older is like, oh, there are different, I know there are many people in me, but there's also different parts of all those people. So it's like the part that comes in that's really, really good at precision. Like, whether it be directing a thing or putting up, crafting language or whatever, I have to be like, oh, could you go over there for a little while? Like, I have to trick myself so that the wrong part doesn't come forward at the wrong time. So there's like sometimes I need to be really emotional and sometimes I need to be impulsive. Sometimes I need to get angry and throw everything out. Sometimes I need to be precise. And very often I need to let go of everything I know about it and like some version of like go to sleep or go into a different like dimension so that it can talk in a different way. And now I understand that, you learn and it takes time. Maybe that's a big thing about you because you raised it specifically about younger artists and process. And I think you have to get to know yourself. And you have to get to know how you relate to your capacity as an artist. And not everything that is going to be the most useful thing is going to be the most comfortable thing in you, in your personality or in your way of thinking. It's not going to be the thing that you can even predict. So it's like a community within you. And then add to that, I generally make everything in deep collaboration. So then you're dealing with all the people and all the things, and people have their things that they have with each other, and then blah, blah. It's like, so it's also like, sometimes you just need to walk, having I think parallel practice. Like, are there other things you do? Like, do you run or do you do yoga or do you cook or do you, whatever your thing is. But I'm a big believer in learning and finding rigor. When we talk about rigor, we, that thing of craft and how you were talking earlier about like wanting to make sure that your work has, has that thing on it, that acuity, that push. That's so important. And I think you can develop that without having to adhere to someone else's aesthetic standards. but you got to know what your things are that you love, and then figure out what you need to do to get good at it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a word. That is a whole word. I love that. And, as I used to tell my students at Howard, your artistry isn't going to be a destination. It's constantly a journey. You're constantly shifting and growing, learning more about yourself and the world. And so your artistry has to have the capacity to grow alongside. Some questions from the audience for you. How did you know when or what you were interested in creating was part of the avant-garde, or was there ever a moment?
I've never been able to do anything in a straight line, so that's it, ever.
I mean, I just remember I did this piece that was about Black men and Black women and how police violence interrupts the, sort of romantic and spiritual love between Black men and Black women. And I thought it was so serious, and the audience kept laughing. And I was I was heartbroken the first time. The first time we staged it, and the audience would break out into laughter. And then a friend of mine told me, he said, people can laugh and think at the same time. And I was like, okay. And then I just had to embrace it. I literally try to do things that are very serious, and people find them hilarious. I had to surrender. And I was like, apparently I have a weird, quirky sense of humor, and that's just what it is. Let me stop fighting it. So I didn't try. I wasn't trying to be avant-garde.
Maybe if I could say one other thing, I was really, for me, I love presence. I love so when I went in to go see, theater or whatever, I remember when I was so lucky, I got a touring company of Shanghai's Spell No. 7 came to Springfield, Massachusetts when I was a teenager. What are the chances?
Right?
That doesn't happen.
Right.
And I went to go see it. And I remember I was so elated to see the work and to see it, structure and all that stuff like that. But I'm always as interested in who's profiling in the audience and who is looking at who and what does the room feel like? And so I always knew that I wanted to make something that attended to every part of the experience. So I wasn't, the story that was being told was not the point. It was the experience, the presence, the performance of the thing. And that's another reason I loved Adrienne Kennedy, because I was like, oh, so many things are happening here. So much is happening at the same time. So I was like, that's how my mind works.
Oh, interesting. All right. When you are creating avant-garde work, what do you need most from the producers who are supporting you that you don't usually get? Does that differ from more traditional work? I'd love to hear this also, because Holly, Transatlantic Time Traveling Company is a Theater Alliance love.
So yeah, my current play that I'm working on was developed with Theater Alliance, with Raymond, and at the time Colin Hovde was the artistic director. But I've said this to you, Raymond. It's literally one of the best production experiences I've ever had.
That's awesome.
Because you all were so caring, so committed to my vision. I'd never gone into a room with 12 people and felt like they were all committed to my vision. I usually go into a room and feel like I have to convince and sell. And even though, I may have been invited or funded or whatever, I still have to do this work of trying to get people on board. And so it was literally the first experience in my life where everybody was like, yep, we're going to make it happen. And I was like, and I don't know how it ends. And I won't know how it ends until 2 days before opening night, because we're still devising the ending. But I've got a timeline. I know what the props look like, so we can get working on those, but it was so much care. And I remember the set had, we put Spanish moss because it was a southern landscape. And all of us were looking up at the sky and being like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much moss is there and how much do we need to add? We decided it was a 5 and we would go up to a 7, but not a 10, because then it gets gothic and spooky. And I was just like, oh my God, these are my people. We are seriously spending energy on the perfection of how the Spanish moss drapes in the tree limbs. And the fact that you got you all with me, we went to
go tree limbs. One of my favorite experiences.
I was like, I know a man in public works from a previous project I did. He's going to get us some trees. And then there weren't enough, so we had to gather some more. But we literally just went and like got broken tree limbs all over Anacostia and brought them to the theater. And like, that's when you know people are ride or die for you, right? Like, there were no questions. Nobody was like, not my job title. We went and hauled lumber. Like, so that's my answer.
Oh, that's dope. That production also, side note, was dope. So dope.
I want to see. I'm jealous now. You know, the thing I would say that I've learned is that, and I can only speak personally, you know, I can't say for every artist, because I think for every artist is probably slightly different, with the exception that thing of trust is so key. But what I know is the work is going to happen in performance. I don't make work that happens on the page. I don't make work even that happens in rehearsal. I make work that happens in performance. And so there is a certain leap of faith that someone working with me has to take that is really a leap of faith, and it's unnerving. You know, I'll never forget when we were opening my show Radiate, and like the night before, you know, and that was one where I was performing as Joe Mama, and Daniel was there for the dress rehearsal, doing all the steps, singing all the notes, whatever, but it was clearly me, and I'm not that. And everybody was like, oh, like, you know, there was sort of this dark feeling like in the room of like, did we just fuck ourselves badly because, you know, the season, you know, like, is it going to be this bad? And it was like, okay, but it was bad. And on opening night, I was sitting in the dressing room at 7:20. I was like, oh my God, you know, this is going to be horrible. And my two co-singers turned to me and they said, hey, Joe, and they could feel the shift happen. And Joe went out onto that stage and tore it up. And the truth is, I know that that's how I work. So I can't manufacture a false object for you. You have to trust that the real thing is going to come. And not everybody's willing to do that, but I've been very fortunate that I've had some incredible producers who get that and who are willing to take that risk with me.
All right, I think I have time for one more question. What artists, I'm actually going to do two questions, yeah, but this is the last one officially from the chat. What artists would you like the community to recover or see on our stages in the future? What artists are there that aren't being celebrated and uplifted, that whose work you would want to see?
I'm going to just shout out my incredible four mothers, Aisha Rahman, Lori Carlos, and Robbie McCauley. Please go back, find their work.
You can ask the second question if other names.
Oh yeah. I'm gonna ask. Then the next question, the last question that I have before I invite Nicole back into the room to wrap us up. What are you working on right now, or what are you looking towards, and how can we, audience, support y'all?
You want to go, Daniel?
Sure, I can say quickly. So I have my first published book of performance texts and plays coming out in March. It'll be a collection of 7 pieces from 25 years. And it's going to be with 53rd State Press. It's called Love Like Light. And so I'd love everybody to read that. And then I'm also working on a new project with the Public Theater that's going to take a while to come into fruition, but it's called Altar Number 5. And it's based on a tarot reading that a great DC denizen, the late Rebecca Rice, gave me back in 1994. So I've been holding on to that reading for all these years, and I'm working with some extraordinary collaborators on that. So those are the things that I'm up on right now.
Dope.
Oh, fantastic. Well, as we mentioned, I'm working with Raymond and Theater Alliance on the Transatlantic Time Traveling Company, which is a traveling medicine show with 3 Black women. It's not clear at first if they're freed women or if they're fugitives, but ultimately they're from the future. And that's what matters. And they've come actually to eradicate a virus that is just, we did this for 2 years ago, to eradicate a virus that is, corrupting the planet. So that's happening. And then I'm in residence with New York Live Arts for production in June, which, was going to be a new iteration of a series I do called Race Talcon Ash, or Race TBD, which is about gentrification, but it's set up like a real sporting event with coaches and a track and referees and the audience on the sidelines, and it should be like really exciting. But not knowing what's going to be possible in June, I've just said, in February we'll talk. And thankfully they are trusting people who are allowing me to do that. So again, it's like the generosity of spirit and the creative trust that's allowing me to navigate these pandemic waters.
Indeed. I want to shout out Live Arts too, and Janet Wong in particular, because she's also helping with this same project. And I think this thing of like, there are people who've made a decision in this turbulent time, and I'm going to go out here and say this, to operate based in love. And I think they're foregrounding something that is like a great lesson about what it means to go forward without going back.
That's real. That's real. Well, I absolutely want to thank both of you. What a conversation. It went all kinds of places. I sent y'all 5 questions and then got in 15 more. And I think I only asked one of the 5. I just want to thank y'all for sharing your brilliance, sharing your artistry. I look forward to collaborating with y'all in the future. I'm going to throw it back over to Nicole Watson, who just came back in the room.
Hi. I was almost late coming back into the room because I was just sitting here listening, and just thank you so much. This has been an amazing conversation. I just want to thank Raymond, Daniel, and Holly for joining us tonight. To anyone listening in, I just want to remind you again that 3 of the 4 Adrienne Kennedy plays are online and are available for you to watch. They are free for students. She is one of our best writers and is deserving of our love and our attention. And the last play, Etta and Ella on the Upper West Side, will be released January 9th, 2021. Thank you all for joining in tonight, and have a wonderful evening. Be well, be safe. Thank you.